what do you remember about working with Dino Bravo in Montreal?
Dino again. When I first went to Montreal, Dino was the booker, and I remember you know, he was beating everything that walked on two legs. He was the booker, so he put himself over like crazy, and a lot of people resented it. And when I said to some people that I was going there, they said, "Oh, you're crazy. The booker's the owner, and the booker's the baby face, the top baby face. So what do you think he's going to do to you? He's going to squash you. He's going to make sure you don't overshine him. I said, well, it's my home, and I just want to see, if that happens, I can always leave right away. So I went there, and we befriended them, and then we got the idea of an angle. When I first came in the territory, him against, because Quebec City and Montreal, there's big rivalry. It's like in the hockey, the Nordiques and the Montreal Canadiens, huge, and that rivalry has been existed for years. So years ago in the wrestling, there was this guy called Barrière Jean. There was like 7 brothers. They were strong, really strong, and we're talking about in the 50s. And there was this guy from Montreal, Yvon Robert, who was again a big wrestling star, and they had this clash, and they really did some good business in those two towns because of that rivalry. And we had the idea, hey, we recreate this atmosphere and all that. So it's funny. A lot of people say, "Oh man, you're crazy to do that." You go in as a babyface and you work against the top babyface. You're gonna. I said, sure, maybe I'll be a heel in Montreal for a while, but in my hometown, that'll be great. And plus, we had this thing that we said, okay, we'll go against each other, and then we will team up together later. So we'll really create a bond there because, we go against each other, and then when two enemies finally meet together and team up together, it means more. Mm-hmm. So we looked at the long-term deal. And sure enough, at first it looked, because I was really over in Quebec, but in Montreal, people were kind of like, ooh, it's like half and half, But when we teamed up, man, wow, we created this situation where he saved me and then I saved him and then we teamed up and wow, the thing. And Dino respected me a lot professionally, and I did too. And he, again, it was like a thing where we admired, and he looked at me as a young brother, and, we had good communication. He didn't feel threatened by me, So we really had a good run there. Very good run. And after that, I bought in a third of the territory with Gino Brito.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you, what do you think the biggest problems were with owning a company?
Well, I think in the case of Honolulu in Hawaii, was me, Peter Maivia, and Steve Ricard. We were 3 partners. So that situation was like, I was the young guy, the booker and the young guy. And, of course, I wanted to bring the young talent in, I remember the night I told Ricard and Peter, I was bringing Roddy Piper. It was like, oh, And then I remember the first big show we did at the Blaisdell, and he worked that night and he did an interview, man. It was fantastic, I was all excited. I went to see them. Isn't that great, man? I succeeded in getting this guy, and Peter was kind of, Peter, he was friends with Dominic Nucci, Cicluna. He wanted to bring those guys in Hawaii, but in Hawaii, it's not like New York, you don't have 10 million people. It's small territory, and you have to really give the people their money's worth. Really work hard to get the fans every week, So we didn't see eye to eye, and so finally I had to buy. I could see that I could never, we had that generation gap and age gap that we didn't see eye to eye, so I left there. In the situation of Montreal, we really saw on the same level. We're on the same level as opposed to Hawaii, but it was in 1985, 86, where the WBF was starting to steamroll every small territory. And we had, our crowds were great. And also the fact that we had that, at that time, the Canadian dollar was so low and we had a lot of US talent. So the difference in the money was like 35%. So the 35% that were supposed to go as a profit for us, we had to make the difference in the salary for the US guys. Because, and plus the television, back then, the television managers used to pay the wrestling. They used to pay a fee for wrestling matches every night. So you air your matches on their television. But Vince bought his way in. Vince used to pay them to have his shows. So the television managers, they had on one hand the great production, big time production, and plus the money. And on the other hand, the 3 small cameras, and you have to pay them. So every week we could feel the pressure coming, and they say, oh, you should upgrade your production. You should do this, look at these guys. And so we couldn't compete with the budget. So finally, I had a meeting with Vince, secret meeting. I flew in one night. Nobody knew about it in Montreal. I took the plane and Terry Garvin picked me up in a limo and we went and met Vince. And I suggested to him the idea about the Can-Am connection. I had Tom Zink working for me there, and Tom was, we knew that Tom and I were going to team up at some time. When we first met, I first met him in Minneapolis, and I took him under my wing and sent him to Oregon. And we knew that something, because he looked too much like me, and there was a lot of similarities. We knew that along the road something was going to happen between us. And so I suggested the idea to Vince, and Vince said, who's this guy? I said, I'm telling you, Vince, man, he's going to be great. And this, okay, let's do it. So I came back to Montreal that night. Nobody knew about it. And then when Dino heard about it, man, he was hot. He was really hot. But I told him, I said, look, Dino, I took him aside. I said, look, we're even now. I said, because 2 years before that, he had done something similar to me. In the fact that I took a summer off when I was world champion in Minneapolis. And I had told him, I said, look, I'll send you this guy, Jimmy Garvin, who he's a great worker, and get him ready for me. And then I'll spend the summer working angles with him in Montreal. So I say, okay. So I sent him, Jimmy goes there and, they put him over and everything. But one thing led to another. He brings in Ronnie Garvin, his brother, and then they do angles with the Rougeaus. Mm-hmm. So I go there and all of a sudden, I have nobody to work with. And I wasted my summer, because Vern had planned for the world champion to work just 3-4 times a month. He said, that'll be great. You won't see the world champion for summer, But in the meantime, I stayed there with a finger up my ass, So I said, look, Dino, I said, you fucked me around once and then you got, he says, we're even now. And then, he kind of, well, yeah, you're right. You're right. He said, I should have done that. And then you got me back. So, okay. Yeah, I understand that. Then we hugged and, and that was business.
Yeah. What do you think happened with Dino?
You mean,
yeah, at the end.
When he got killed?
Yeah.
Okay. Here's the story that I got is that, Dino, unfortunately, he tried to stay in the business, but he just couldn't. Vince, didn't want to go back. Didn't want to have him back. And I remember I called Pat Patterson and I suggested that I team up with Dino because I like Dino so much. Because I says, look, so we'll team up. I'll take the bumps and I'll be the moving around, and him can do the strong stuff. So I'm sure we can make it work. And I said, no, we just, Dino doesn't fit anymore in the plans and this and that. And Dino had kind of painted himself in the corner because Dino liked the high lifestyle. I mean, he had a Mercedes, sports Mercedes. He had a big home, and he just, after wrestling was over, and Dino couldn't be a 9-to-5 guy. I mean, and didn't have any business experience of any kind, and wrestling was all his life. And back then, WWF was the only game in town, Mm-hmm. So if you can do it for WWF, what could he do? And in a way, unfortunately for him, his uncle was the head of the mafia in Montreal, you know. So they would always say, hey, Dino, why don't you come, and we're fun. And I remember him, we're in Europe, and Dino had a daughter, and says, Rick, says, I know, I could go in the crime deal and do really good money. He says, but I don't want to go that route, He says, I know myself, and man, when he confided that in me, he says, I know myself, and I know what kind of guy I am, and because Dino was the kind of guy that more and more, and so he knew himself and he knew his demons inside, and he says, my daughter and all that, he says, I want to do a quiet style, but then his payments and all that and his lifestyle got too much, and all of a sudden the revenue weren't coming. And I remember the breaking point in him is that when he had to go borrow money from his mom, and he told me, he says, man, I can't, that's too much for me. He says, so he started going at, and back then in early 90s, there were the cigarette trafficking in Canada that started. A lot of people were, trafficking cigarettes, and a lot of people were doing it. I remember like lawyers would do it, or anybody, would sell cigarettes. And so Dino got in with that, and Dino went to see the Indians, and the Indians were big wrestling fans, So when they saw Dino, oh man, so they started dealing strictly with Dino. So Dino had the monopoly with the Indians, because the Indians, they have the river there. They can pass cigarettes like crazy or whatever, armed or whatever, And so they did he was doing really well. And at that time, I was in the business still, and so a friend of mine that I was pretty close with him told me the story is that the cigarettes business was doing so great that the cocaine people, saying, hey, look, maybe there's some money for us in there too, So the big cocaine guy apparently went to see Dino and said, look, you let me in on your cigarette deals and I'll let you in on some cocaine deal. So what apparently happened, they did some kind of agreement, and what apparently happened is that Dino had a shipment, a $400,000 shipment in some warehouse somewhere, and it stayed there for like 3 days. And on the third day, when the cocaine guy went to pick it up, the RCMP and all the police were there, and so they were blaming each other. Dino said, "Oh, you should have picked it up the first day; it never happened, and you shouldn't let it sit there." So there was a lot of heat on Dino, and Dino was kind of so there was a lot of heat on him a week before that happened. A week before he died, and so they had somebody, an inside person, because there was no force of entry in this house, and it was in the winter, so the snow, you could see if there would be print of feet, footprints close to wherever the entry was, but there was none. And also Dino died, he had the remote control in his hand because it was a Wednesday night, so he was watching hockey, and his wife and his daughter were into ballet lessons. Mm-hmm. And in fact, his wife found him that night. Mm-hmm. She had her daughter in her arms, and she came in, and luckily, thank God, his daughter was sleeping in her mother's arms, so she didn't see her dad. But there was blood on the ceiling, and it was horrible. They pumped 10 bullets in his head. So apparently that's what happened. It was an inside job, and they shot him from behind. So it's probably somebody that was watching hockey with him and said, look, I'm going to go to the bathroom. Went to the bathroom because the detective told us that they shot him from behind because the remote control was loose in his hand. They say that if, they shoot you from the front, you crisp your muscles, and then, you hold on to that remote control, and then nothing could. So they shot him from behind. He didn't see anything. The guy pumped 10 bullets on him.